what their impressions are, or what their take-home messages are, if you like, at the end. So just a heads up, Chris is going to be asking you a few questions and asking for a comment from everybody at the end of the session. But let me move on. Our two exciting delegates for you are Janine Warner, who is the founder and CEO of J.C. Warner Communications, and Mr. Michael Bull, Department of Media and Film at the University of Sussex. I'm not going to say any more than that because they have a joint presentation, which I am told is interactive. So that's another plea to stay engaged. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you.
And we're also going to stand up.
We've been sitting all day. The least we can do is stand.
Yeah. This is,
We're working on that, but we're counting on you to help.
what we thought, we'd do bits, and then we'd say, we've got bits for you to come in and say, well, what do you think? So it won't be just talking, then you talking. It will be more interactive in that way, yeah?
That's the idea. I should also say that although he claims we've spent a couple days preparing, I did meet him yesterday, and I think we spent about an hour on this. But
yeah.
I like the idea of making it interactive and opening it up. So did you want to say a few things about your
Okay, so this session's a little bit different, and we're a little bit different, I think, in as much as my expertise is essentially looking backwards rather than looking forwards. Yeah? So that all academic research tends to be research based on what people do. So most of the things that I'll be talking about will come from my recent study of, I did a global study of 1,000 iPod users around the globe, but not Japan. And it's qualitative research. So I'll be drawing elements of that in terms of, say, looking at the contradictions and the fine details about often high-end consumers, essentially. That's my bit.
For my part, I have a background in journalism, and I've worked for many years now in the internet, and I usually speak to very non-technical audiences about technology. So I'm going to reverse that a little bit and try and remind you that behind all the technology we've been talking about are real living humans that have to use these products. And I think it's very important that we all keep that in perspective as we're talking about these great, amazing things you can do with RFID tags and everything else. Who are the people who actually use them, and how do we make sure they're always in our minds? So we thought we'd start with looking a little bit at how people misunderstand consumers.
Yeah, and I was talking about this example the other day, actually. There was this first one here, which is just a London underground tube station. The first Nokia advert for MP3 phones actually had a fairly lengthy advert or advertising campaign in the UK. And what it did, it showed a very attractive woman wearing, the headset. And she was waiting for a train, and she started getting carried away with the music and started singing and shuffling around. And the audience, people walking by, started throwing money at her feet. And she was so carried away that she missed the train. And I happened to be in Helsinki at a conference where I was talking to one of the main Nokia designers, and I said, well, actually, do you realize that this advert actually totally misunderstood the nature of what a person's doing when they're using this device? That is, the primary aim is to always be in control. So you've just showed someone being out of control, i.e., no one will buy this from that advert. So there's lots of lessons to be learned from that, but that's the misunderstanding bit.
Brilliant, and I love that example. Beware your marketing department. I probably don't have to tell most of you that. But I think too often, the technical people who really understand their product kind of leave to the hands of the marketing people how to sell it. And I can imagine that ad of that woman getting all that attention and making money like she's a Subway performer got great attention and looked good as an ad, but it completely missed the fact that most of us want to isolate when we put our iPhones in and not talk to anyone, right? So in contrast, what do you think of the iPhone ads? Anybody think they're doing a better job? Have you seen some of the iPhone ads that show you can take Facebook with you on your cell phone. You can find a map in real time and plot your trip across San Francisco. Do you think that's a little more on track with how consumers are using technology? Apple in general has done a pretty good job of understanding their market, so I would use that as kind of a contrast to his example.
And they've localized their ads in a very powerful way.
Please, what impresses you about what they've done with that?
It's very simple. Apple praises themselves on doing complicated things that then seem very simple. And I think their advertising campaigns, they did the obvious. They just found out what the top websites were for any given country, and they advertised based on that.
That you can use that on your cell phone.
And
now.
it so happened that Facebook and Google were popular across the board, but there were a lot of local sites that were highlighted in their mainstream advertising TV campaigns in only certain markets.
And
Very
Eric
smart.
sits on Apple's board too, that helps.
Full disclosure, full disclosure.
No comment on that.
But another thing that's right on target about their
Please.
iPhone advertising is that it features the real seductive product benefit of the interface.
It's
And
sexy.
somehow they make you feel what it's like to use it to do those clever things, not all of which you can do quite that way the first time. But they are really featuring the benefit without flogging it.
If you haven't seen their ads, because I know they're not in all countries yet, they tend to show something like, if you use Facebook on your computer all the time, imagine what it's like to take it with you. And then after you're all caught up in this new use of your phone, the ad shows a phone call come in. And oh yeah, by the way, it is a phone, which I think is also clever to kind of remind you at the end that it does still serve the original purpose. Here's another one that kind of caught my eye, and thinking about how consumers have changed. So we have this ad here of this father and son. This is from Condé Nast's new portfolio, very high-end magazine. So expensive watch, you don't just buy this watch, it's a family heirloom that you pass on to your children. And I thought, well, that's really sweet, except how many young people wear watches these days? I'm kind of old. I still wear a watch,
I haven't
right?
got one.
Why are young people not wearing watches anymore? Anybody seen this study? Because their cell phone tells them what time it is, right? And if they do wear a watch, it'll probably be like Michael's, which I really want that watch. It's a Fossil, by the way. I was studying it last night that tells him and connects to his Bluetooth. So watch out about this kind of thing, too. You know, this conception that a watch is something we pass on to our children is quickly getting outdated. So keeping up with young people and keeping up with how people are using new technology can help you maybe market that high-end phone in a better way and watch out for the mistakes you might make with a watch. Other examples that people have seen, good ads, bad ads, things that miss the boat.
Just a quick comment on the
Please.
watch one. You have to remember that they're selling the watch to the old guy, not the young guy. Right?
Now that's a good point. That's a very good
So,
point.
so the fact that his son is never going to wear it is not something he's thought about.
And it won't stop him from buying it. I grant you that. I'm talking to a technical audience about their products, but that's a very good point. I was in Colombia recently with people who were trying to advertise university services. And they were telling me they didn't want to advertise in newspapers because they wanted young people who don't read newspapers. And I said, but aren't parents a big part of that decision? So you're right, if you're trying to reach the older population, sometimes you do need those older models. Other ads, other ideas?
Right,
Thanks.
okay. So we've seen over the last 2 days that there's lots of different consumers, and I'm kind of knowledgeable about certain sorts of consumers, like high-end market early adopters, and we'll talk a little bit later about how representative they may be in terms of future consumers, for example, because they're an important group. And and you know, so shall I just do a little bit on the? Yeah. See, it's not totally worked out. And certainly, when you look at high-end consumers, the Apple consumers that I've looked at, certainly it's not the case that things like cost is that important for them. In some cases, the more expensive, the better. Yeah, certainly in terms of iPod sales, as it's become more mass, it has become slightly more price conscious, I think. But yesterday, people mentioned things like lifestyle products, etc. And certainly, Apple have been very successful in harnessing their products around a kind of lifestyle image, for example. But in fact, one mustn't forget that the actual product itself is in fact, in a sense, a design market leader. So it kind of fulfills the blurb, if you like. And I'll just read a quote. I've got a few quotes as we go through, but this is of an early iPod user. And she says, the design is just flawless. It feels good to hold in your hand, to rub your thumb over the navigation wheel and touch the smooth white surface. It looks nice. I'm proud of owning such a device. It represents and holds an important part of my life, so I don't want any ugly package around it. I've never cherished anything I bought as much as this little device. When I was a child, I used to watch a kids' show called The Music Machine, and I always dreamt of having something like that, a device that plays any song there is. The iPod comes pretty close to the fulfillment of this childhood fantasy. And iPod users don't swap their iPods for other machines. Once you've got them, they keep them. And then they go and buy iPhones and stuff like this. So there is a kind of lifestyle element to that. But also there's this thing that, in fact, Apple, of course, transformed the MP3 market from, if anybody saw the early MP3 players, the best way to get music out of them was to kneel down and pray to the machine, because, in fact, they never... And, of course, Apple also produced iTunes. And so they had the connection between the home computer, the iPod, and iTunes, which is a magnificent marketing strategy, which is still highly successful, and to some extent spurred on the whole MP3 development. So, so the thing there is high-end consumers, lots of money. They're not going to be subject to some of the other things we're going to be talking about, and lifestyle, brand loyalty, and that seems to me a pretty good market model. Yeah? So.
I think we both agreed it was important with this audience and with the range of things we're talking about to remember the diversity of consumers. So it's very hard to make generalizations about this market. Gentleman back there who said several times, price is so important, you've got to keep it low. And absolutely, if you're rioting over food prices right now, you're not thinking about an iPhone. But there is a very high-end market as well. So we're trying to kind of jump around and touch on all of these markets. And don't forget that middle market. Just a personal anecdote from my own life. I went to get my hair done recently. I live in LA, that's very important. And I never thought of a hair salon as a place where cell phones were really popular. But I noticed around the room that everybody who worked in the salon had a BlackBerry on their table. And so I was talking to my hairdresser, what do you do with it? And she said, well, I keep all of my contact information. No surprise. I chat with my boyfriend all day. No surprise. I keep all of the personal details of my clients. What color they like, how they like things cut. That's a little more interesting. She said, but the best use is that I can be online all day. I thought, well, what are you surfing the web for? She said, the Perez Hilton site. Because I get all the celebrity gossip, and I can talk to my clients all day. And I know the latest thing they want to hear. And I have to admit, I would never have thought of this use. It's not where I spend my time on the internet. But it really caught my attention how many places, like beauty salons, where everybody in the salon now has a cell phone, has a BlackBerry sitting there. So don't overlook that middle group of people that may not be such obvious consumers. So what other examples? I've heard some great ones, and I hope you'll share with us now. Some examples that you've seen in emerging markets that I've heard, or at the high-end markets. What are the uses you've seen that really surprised you?
I haven't.
Oh, they haven't.
I can give one great example in the emerging market context, which is remittances, payments.
Yes, this is great.
Which is really taking off in a number of places in the world.
Can you give us a specific example?
Yeah, I can give a specific example that we are involved in. We developed with the help of the UK government a service that's called Empresa, which we rolled out in Kenya with Safaricom. We are a 50% shareholder in Safaricom. And that service has now 2 million users, which is an unbelievable number considering that the population is maybe, I don't know exactly, but maybe 15 million, 20 million, and obviously not fully mobile penetrated. And what the service does, basically, it allows people who work in the city to send money to their relatives in, in the countryside, or to people who are out of job and so forth, and they can then, cash that in with Safaricom shops or use it as top-up credit on their phones.
Fantastic.
Great service.
Fantastic. In the U.S., there's a lot of talk about remittances back to Latin America and other countries, and I think cell phones are a great way. We'll see more of that. Other examples that people have seen they could share? Yes.
Well, just some rather bizarre examples, because Jens mentioned Safaricom. They also did a campaign to save elephants. They were actually monitoring ivory tusk theft. There was another case where people were using mobile devices to track the progress of avian flu. I think that was in Africa as well. So there's some pretty amazing things actually that wireless is being used for, non-typical applications.
Yes, excellent. Excellent. Any high-end examples? Anybody doing something? Okay. If you think of others throughout this, I know one of the things that Bankinter, that I heard that they are looking for, is practical examples and how people will really use these technologies. So I think the more ideas you have to bring it to life, sure.
Yeah, let me share something that we did, but it was actually 5 years ago with the old SMS technology. Some hospitals do have problems in calling donors, blood donors, when there is an accident. Normally the way they do it is they have the list of donors and they start calling them by phone, one by one, until all the needs for blood has been covered. What we did was a very easy SMS alert system.
Sure.
So when there's a need at the hospital, they just send the SMS, and in a matter of seconds, all the donors do have an SMS asking for, donation, and they flow to the hospital very quickly. So it's a very efficient way of, bringing people to those cases.
Excellent.
If I may add to this nice example, in Holland, the police use SMS in case of a crime. They send an SMS message to the people in that area to ask them if they had seen anything of importance.
Looking for witnesses to the crime. Wow. We could use that in LA.
Just to point, one of the downsides of alerting, there was, after a tsunami, there was a country that introduced a tsunami warning by SMS. Unfortunately, people went down to the beach to go and have a look for it, so that was probably a little bit counterproductive. But maybe something completely different and completely counterintuitive. There are some people working on prepaid computing as well. To me, it seems completely anti-intuitive, but I'm the wrong demographic. They are looking at selling packages of laptops to particularly kids going to college, where basically you pay a kind of a monthly rate. At the end of a couple of years, you've basically paid for the laptop, you've paid for wireless service, and you own the laptop at the end of it. And that seems to be quite an interesting service. I know Michael's not there, is he? Microsoft's got some sort of prepaid computing platform that they use in Mexico, I think. Again, it sounds anti-intuitive, but it's quite interesting to put a laptop together with wireless connectivity and sell it to a younger generation that, quite frankly, doesn't like wires of any kind. They just don't like being tethered. So.
Well, there's another example there, actually, which is in a suburb of Lima, where the poor were moved out of shanty towns and put into a new housing development. But the new housing development didn't really take account of their social needs. And because they were quite poor, they weren't connected to the telephone lines. And the public spaces of this where they lived were pretty inhospitable, even though where they came was much friendlier, And so the inhabitants had mobile phones, but they used mobile phones in order not to go out. So in fact, again, that's another counterintuitive example of, say, a third world example, for example.
Let me give you two quick examples, which also talks to different behavioral patterns. Not as cool as your hairdresser example, but two in China. In China, the drivers of these two examples, which are done by a company that we've invested in, are behavioral patterns. So in China, the voicemail penetration of telephony across the board, fixed and mobile, is 0.4%. It's very, very low. And it's kind of uncool in China to leave. The reason for that is uncool to leave a voicemail message because A, it costs you money when you're recording the voicemail message, and B, you're causing the other guy to spend money to retrieve the voicemail message. So in China, one of the applications that we've rolled out, it's called missed call reminder. So if you're either out of the network or your phone is switched off, you're on a phone or whatever, and I called, let's say I was calling Anya, The first thing that happens is when Anya powers on her phone or when she's back in the network, it says, hey, did you know, she gets an SMS that says, hey, did you know that Carlos calls you? Importantly, Carlos calls you, not 139-183-99178, because it maps to her address book on her phone. But what's really cool is it tells me as soon as she's gotten that SMS message, it says, hey, do you know that Anya is now available if you still want to call her? So this missed call reminder goes both ways, and it actually bridges the gap of telephony to SMS. So that's one example. The second example, and I wish Christoph was still in here, it's this location-aware service, but this is kind of a funny one. So the mayor of a province that I'm going to go unnamed commissioned our company to build this location-based service. And effectively, it uses a combination of cell towers and your mobile phone ID to pretty much pinpoint where you are. And so we rolled it out, and the mayor was really thrilled about it. And so he was visiting a nearby province, and he shows up and he was supposed to be meeting with the police chief, but let's just say he had other private business that interfered with meeting this police chief of this other province.
Something he didn't want public.
Yeah, it wasn't a good idea. Anyway, so he called and he says, hey, you know, I didn't make it. My flight wasn't, you know, on time, or I can't remember what the excuse was. And the police chief of the outer province, who we'd also sold the application to, pointed out to him, I know you're exactly 10 kilometers from where I am. So let's talk about exactly how this would work. Interestingly enough, that application has been disconnected in China for that reason. So the two examples, missed call reminder and a location-based presence, are just talking to the behavioral patterns in China.
There are a lot of people worried about being followed by these systems. One more before we go on?
Yeah, sorry about this, but Carlos just reminded me of another case which is interesting, and that is in countries like Pakistan where the literacy levels are lower, even texting is a problem.
Sure.
So believe it or not, they've come up with a new form of voice messaging service, which is basically an instant voice message as a direct text replacement. And all of the operators in Pakistan have started doing that. There's some vendors, one's called Bubble Talk or Bubble Motion or something, but it's a direct response to the fact that people want to join into the kind of text messaging phenomena, but they're not literate, so they do it with voice instead, which is quite counterintuitive. But
It's the combination of voice, email, and SMS, right?
So are they speaking in very short phrases? I mean, they
literally.
Yeah, interesting.
Apparently it's taking off in other markets now as well, but it was literally driven by that sort of lack of literacy.
Very interesting.
I was in India last week, and my driver, when we were talking about times to be picked up, etc., said, just send me a missed call, and I'll pick you up downstairs. Send me a missed call.
I love that. Well, yes, in places where you don't have to pay if somebody calls you back, that's really common to call, and then they'll call you back after they do it. But send me a mixed call is a phrase you wouldn't hear very often. It's great. For those of you who are really interested in what young people are doing these days, I highly recommend the work. This is a professor at the University of Southern California. Some of you know Mimi Ito. She and a number of other professors have been really studying how young people use technology. For years, she's been studying teenagers in Japan, in large part because they're at least a couple years ahead of US and other markets. So she's got some great stuff, and they have this digital youth project is coming out soon. So highly recommend that for just understanding your audience.
This is
a plug for my friend here.
This is unashamedly, plugging the research, and it's got a very nice title with no iPod on the front of it because I thought it would date too quickly. But in fact, it's the first piece of proper global research on what people do with this type of technology. And
you want to share one more quote?
One
He's
more
got a
quote.
wonderful
One more
collection
quote.
of
Actually, yeah, I will.
Very real quotes from his research.
Yeah, we're going to talk about ambivalent consumption in a minute, but in fact, this quote is very interesting because, of course, when you do proper research, you find that people tell you stuff that is quite difficult to unpack and to work out what it means. But this is a great quote. This is a woman from New York. When I did the research, the New Yorkers were the most rude people of all. Other people were kind of fairly civil about other people, but New Yorkers were. Anyway, but this one. Well, I think I've come to the conclusion that overall I feel pretty out of control in my life. She's got a very good job, this woman. Stores play music to get me to buy more. Work tells me what to do and when. Traffic decides how quickly I get from here to there, very much resonances from this morning. Even being in public places forces me to endure other people and their habits. The guy slurping his soup, the brat crying for a piece of candy. I didn't realize how much I yearned for control and probably peace and quiet. Strange, since I'm blasting music in my ears. I think I'm really tired of living on someone else's schedule. The iPod has given me some control back. It's a very rich quote.
Excellent consumer
anyway,
insight.
but that's,
Oh,
in a minute, a bit later, we'll talk about what I call a hyper-post-forwardist consumer at the high end. And she's pretty representative, and you can see it's quite contradictory as well. A difficult market, difficult to sell to somebody like this unless the product's absolutely right. So,
very good. I want to remind you, too, that consumers aren't just consuming your products, they're using them to create content. And as somebody who has a background in journalism, I'm especially interested in news. But almost every major world event or catastrophe now comes to us instantly, in large part because almost everywhere, there's someone with a cell phone with video. So remembering that they're not just passive consumers, they're really active. And young people especially are much more interested in producing their own content than just consuming other people's. So I would toss out the question again, examples of collaborative production. Anybody seen people working together with cell phones to create something new, or using their cell phone to develop something?
So can you repeat the question again?
The question, and that's okay, we can always come back to them.
yeah,
we
we'll
have
come
several.
back. We've got loads to. We've
Oh,
still
we have
got
a little bit of
loads.
time.
And they've cut 15 minutes off our presentation.
What time are we supposed to end?
So minutes.
sorry?
So we've only got
Yes.
10 left, so maybe
So
we'll.
I'll just share this, which I thought was kind of an interesting look and a transition to another topic. This is a band in the UK that recently did a great publicity stunt. They went to all the security cameras around the country and filmed themselves performing in front of the security cameras. Then they filed a Freedom of Information request to demand that video, produced their own music video from that footage, and put it back out to the web. Brilliant, brilliant viral marketing, but a very clever way to bring attention to those cameras. And another point that I think is really important to think about, and at least something in the US that's highly, highly sensitive, is this whole issue of privacy and the comparison of privacy versus convenience. And so I have a couple little examples to walk you through, and I welcome, again, your thinking about how this affects your work and what you may do to think about it. So somebody did a study about young people giving away too much information on the internet. And so they counseled a bunch of school kids, and they said, don't give your email address to anyone you meet online. And all the kids said, okay. And then they sent them off to the internet and quickly had somebody appear who asked for their email address. They said, oh no. Then they let them play a little bit, and then they sent somebody else. And they said, if I give you a candy bar, will you give me your email address? 90% of them said yes. And so when they asked them later, why did you give them your email address? And they all said, they offered me a candy bar. It was a perfect excuse. So I was thinking about this with privacy, and I thought, what's your candy bar? What's the candy bar for your consumer? So here's one that some of you might be able to relate to. How many of you have been stuck in line in an airport security line? Yeah, come on. We all travel way too much. So in the US now and in some other countries, they're working on these security cards. So if you ask the average person in the US, would you agree to a detailed background search, to having your irises scanned, to this potentially very invasive background check? Most Americans would say, absolutely not. But if you say, you could save 20 minutes in the airport, it's amazing how many of them say yes. So one question to think about, as you think about consumers and privacy, is what's your consumer's candy bar? What will make them do that? What will make them give up that information? And is it worth it? But it's a very important conversation, and it's one that's already come up quite a bit in this conversation.
So I thought, actually, we've only got a few minutes. Should we skip ahead, actually, and do the different sorts of consumers?
Sure,
Should we do that?
sure.
But you've got.
Anybody have a burning desire to talk about this in our limited time? It's already come up a bit.
Yeah. I thought we'd do this is parallel universes.
So this is a lot of Professor Bull's research here.
Essentially, I think it's quite useful to look at where consumer culture is, and it seems to me that we have a combination of Fordism, post-Fordism, hyper-post-Fordism. Fordism, you know, which is the idea of you can have any car as long as it's black. Post-Fordism is, to some extent, the model we were working on maybe up to 10 years ago, which is niche marketing. And if you look at the proliferation of media, different media, basically people will consume, I don't know, country and western music channels, etc. Hyper-post-Fordism, which is a term I coined myself, is for kind of individualized forms of consumption. Now, it seems to me that, in fact, the three things work in parallel. Fordism still exists sometimes in the same consumer. So, for example, if you're in England, 13 million people like to watch Coronation Street on a Wednesday at 7:30 or whatever. And there's something about it being on in a regular time that is, in fact, comfortable for them. If they miss it, now they can get iPlayer, which allows them to watch it later. Post-Fordism, when you're driving home on a Friday night, you'll probably like to listen to, I don't know, Jimmy Young or whatever it is, and that seals the end of your week. So it's important that that stuff is structured for you. Yeah? Hyper-post-Fordism is when, in fact, you're individualizing your consumption, and that's pretty typical of high-end consumers now. And there's kind of an identical picture of a hyper-post-Fordist consumer. They like to always be in control. They like individualized consumption packages. They're very sensitive to their relationship with producers of whatever commodity it is. They have a very high level of expectation and a very quick to be intolerant of any failure whatsoever. Yet, they also are, in fact, high-level consumers. That is, consumption is a form of second nature to them. Yeah? So, in fact, they express themselves increasingly through patterns of consumption. Now, that's quite a strange mix, actually, and I kind of thought, if I have time, I'll just go through. There's a great example I thought I'd do with them. One of my iPod users, for example, who's telling me why he likes to consume in the way that he does. And he frames it around elimination of waste. And he says this, if I've got time. Elimination of waste. When I listen to music radio, there are so many commercials that it becomes pointless. When I listen to television, there are so many commercials, it's almost pointless. When I listen to the iPod, I can be assured that my 30 minutes of music listening will be 30 minutes of music listening. Elimination of waste 2, drivel. FM has become AM because DJs talk over the beginning and end of songs and frequently cut off the beginning or end of the song. When I listen to the iPod, I can be assured that I will hear the song in its entirety and untainted. Elimination of waste 3, unwanted music. When I press play, I can be assured that my iPod will play whatever I want without filler songs, without commercials, etc., etc. Elimination of waste 4, last one, other. Instead of becoming a mindless receiver of uncontrolled noise, the iPod makes me selective and interactive. I use the iPod to improve my language skills. I use it to read books I'd not normally have time to read. And I use it to listen to time-shifted technical broadcasts and news talk radio. Now, that's quite a good example of somebody saying, I'm reclaiming the schedule for myself, actually. But at the same time, being immersed in the media as well. So it's not an escape out of consumption, it's an immersion in consumption. And that's kind of quite interesting. Certainly with my iPod users, they kind of listened to music about twice as much as they'd previously done. And over a 2-year period, there wasn't much reduction, if any, in their use of it. That is, the technology hadn't become routinized. Now, that may have something to do with the special place of music, for example. But in fact, if you look at mobile phone use, for example, that very quickly becomes routinized in certain areas, I think. So that's something to think about.
Excellent. Well, and I think that's a good example of the importance of good consumer research. You learn things about your customers you may not know. But he reminded me of another of my favorite quotes from Ford, and I felt compelled to share. We all know the quote that he said, any color you want as long as it's black. But there's another quote where he said, if I had asked my consumers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, too. Too often, the very people we're trying to serve have no idea what's possible. And I think there's a very delicate balance when you think about your consumers between trying to really listen to them and trying to really serve what they want and using what you know that they aren't even aware of to give them something better than a faster horse. So, should we stop on that note? Or?
Is that it?
That's a great note to stop on.
Yeah.
We have a little more, but it's really...
The fast horse.
In the interest of... I know many of you have to get to that line at the airport today, so...
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.